Distinguished colleagues and guests, the Dissertation Board for the degree of Doctor of Philosophy, Candidate of Sciences, is called to order to consider the dissertation submitted by Tatyana Kornilyeva in the subject 100103, Foreign Literature, Literature of the Middle East and Far East, under the title Shanshu genre in Chinese literature. I urge the audience to switch off their mobile devices. Thank you for compliance. The defense is broadcast live on St. Petersburg State University website. Simultaneous interpretation into English is provided. May I inform you that according to Federal Law 143 as of May 23, 2016, St. Petersburg State University and Moscow State University have been granted an exceptional title to independently award scientific degrees. Hereby, scientific degrees are awarded only in the subjects and scientific areas contained in the relevant scientific subjects register issued by the Russian Ministry of Education. May I inform the audience that according to paragraph 17, section 3, rules of the PhD granting procedure in St. Petersburg State University, the thesis council is not considered legitimate unless 2/3 or over of the appointed composition, but no less than 4 members, are present at the meeting. Today, the composition is 5 members. All members, correction, 4 members are present, including 1 international member who has joined us online. We can see and hear each other by conference communication. Thus, the quorum is there. According to paragraph 19, section 4, on the Thesis Council meeting of the aforementioned rules of procedure, the time limit of the meeting is 120 minutes. The agenda is as follows: a brief report of the chairperson on the documents submitted by the defendant in compliance with the requirements, a Q&A session, a brief report of the defendant on the findings of the research, 15 minutes maximum, questions as to the defendant's report, 2 minutes per question, and defendant's replies. 4. Presentation of the reports submitted to the Dissertation Board. Members of the board take turns to announce their reports, focusing on elaborate argumentation behind their assessment, as well as questions and suggestions addressed to the defendant, 10 minutes maximum. General commentaries of the defendant addressed to the members of the board, 15 minutes maximum. 6. Open discussion and statements by members of the audience who are not members of the board. Only strictly relevant suggestions, questions and feedback addressed to the defendant are accepted. All willing to take the floor should register in the registration list beforehand. Please introduce yourself before delivering your statement. 7. Defendant's reply to statements of the audience who are not members of the Dissertation Board, 5 minutes maximum. 8. Statement of the research supervisor. 9. 5 minutes break before open voting on awarding the defendant with the aspired academic degree. The discussion between members of the Dissertation Board is not broadcast online. 10. Open voting by name, count of vote, and registration of the voting results in the protocol. Decision-making, pass or fail. 11. Concluding statement by the defendant, 2 minutes maximum. The dissertation submitted by Tatyana Kornilyeva In the subject 100103 in literature, literature of the Middle and Far East, under the title Shanshu genre in Chinese literature, was approved for the defense under the decree issued by the director of the St. Petersburg State University Defense Supervision Center as of January 24th, 2017. The composition of the dissertation board was approved under relevant decree issued on January 23rd, 2017. The composition is as follows: Michael Suvorov, Doctor of Philology, Professor of the Arabic Philology Department, Chairman of the Board; Igor Gerasimov, Doctor of History, Candidate of Sciences in Philology, Docent, Department of the History of the Middle East, St. Petersburg State University; Mikhail Pelevin, Doctor of Philology, Professor, Chair of Iranian Philology Department, St. Petersburg State University; Igor Alimov, Doctor of Historical Sciences, Head of Ethnography of Eastern and Southeastern Asia of the Museum of Anthropology by Peter the Great, Director of the Publishing House of St. Petersburg Oriental Studies; Alexander Fedotov, Professor, Doctor of Philology, Director of the Korean Studies Center, University of Sofia, Director of Sejong Institute. The defendant submitted the following documents to the Supervision Center. First, application addressed to St. Petersburg State University Rector Kropachev to consider the dissertation for defense, submitted on December 26, 2016. Second, report by the research supervisor, Doctor of Philology, Professor of Chinese Philology Department, Alexander Sterozhuk. Third, list of publication comprising 4 papers that reflect the key findings of the research, including 3 papers published with peer-reviewed journals in the register of the Ministry of Education and Science of Russia. Fourth, a certificate number 476 issued to Kornilyeva Tatyana, certifying that she has successfully passed 3 final exams in the following disciplines: literature of foreign countries, philosophy, history and philosophy of science, grade B. A diploma with honors issued by St. Petersburg State University, certifying that Tatyana Kornilyeva has an MA in Oriental and African Studies under the decision issued by Supreme Board of Assessors as of June 21, 2010. 6. The conclusion of the Chinese Philology Department, St. Petersburg State University, recommending the dissertation for defense of the scientific degree of Doctor of Philosophy, Candidate of Sciences, in the subject Literature of Foreign Countries. 7. Dissertation in Russian and English translation, both in soft and hard copy, set up in accordance with GOST 7.0 and printed on a printing machine. I should note that all the above-mentioned documents are in full compliance with Provision 12, Section 3, submission of documents for defense. Are there any questions to me? If there are no questions, may I now give the floor to the defendant. Your time limit is 15 minutes. Please switch on the mic. Hello, do you hear me? Distinguished Chairman, distinguished members of the dissertation board, colleagues and friends. My work is indeed innovative because it has never been studied in Russian sinology. This is Chinese religious literature, Shanshu, a book appealing to virtue. This term is rarely mentioned in Russian research papers. Some works in Shanshu genre were translated into Russian. Here I mean Ippolit Baranov's translation of book of Jasper Statius, dating back over a century ago. However, what Shanshu is indeed a groundbreaking question. Therefore, we have to identify what we mean by this term, Shanshu. China has a long-standing tradition of didactic books being given out for free in temples. It originated hundreds of years ago, and it is still there. Such books offer some spiritual guidelines as well as instructions on hygiene, healthy diets, etc. Believers publish such books to glorify the deity. Often, personal contributions or donations by philanthropists are allocated to publish those. Additionally, such books on virtue may contain a number of texts that have been reproduced for hundreds of years under the same title, but minor differences in the text depending on the epoch. Those texts are primarily the Jade Scrolls, or the so-called classical texts that will be mentioned later. But to be able to classify those as Shanshu, what we have to address is the collections of such books, but we also have to trace their perception over time. To this end, my task was to analyze texts that are in library collection, as well as with different variations of one and the same text. But I also collected those texts during my trips throughout China, during my talks with monks. I'm highly grateful to those who provided assistance in these highly challenging tasks, and I'm also grateful to my colleagues who provided me with some extra material. As a result, I managed to collect a highly remarkable collection of Shanshu texts. Some of them include traditional versions, whereas others are more tailored for the younger generation and are done in the genre of comics. There are also Shanshu texts that are there to teach calligraphy. And there is one book that is written on A4 lists with an ink pen. The research on Shanshu are scarce. However, among those existing are the research paper of a Japanese researcher, the monography by Sinzin that was published in the late Imperial China by Professor Yu Zian. The way how we can attribute a text to Shanshu is not yet there. Therefore, primarily, my task was to come up with an original definition of Shanshu and to analyze the classification. The first chapter of my dissertation is devoted to the perception of Shanshu texts and the way that those were spread. Here, for the first time, I challenged to identify the term Shanshu. As mentioned previously, this term is used in several meanings. First, in a broader sense, it is any popular piece of popular literature of didactic nature or whatever printed text that is addressed to believers and is distributed for free in temples. Second, a narrow sense is that it is a folk spiritual literature of didactic nature which addresses a broad circle of readers. And lastly, in a colloquial sense, it is the same as Bao Zhuan. Besides, there is one more definition that I will focus on later. In 1806, out of a vast majority of spiritual texts that were called Shanshu, 3 texts were chosen: the Taishan book, the Wenchan guides, and the canon of Guan Yui. Some of them call those the classic Shanshu genre. Professor Yu Zian, in his classification of Shanshu, identifies those texts separately. In Western sinology, quite intuitively, I believe that the Taishan book is called the classic in the Shanshu genre, with no extra clarification as to what they mean by the very notion of genre. Therefore, I may state that out of the vast variety of Shanshu texts, we can outline the so-called classical texts. Those texts belong to the Shanshu genre by scholars. However, none of those would ever come up with some clear definitions of this genre. After meticulous study of those texts, well, indeed, it is possible to claim that those are really specific and can be rather attributed to a specific standalone genre that we will later call the genre of Shanshu. The second chapter of the research focuses on the features and properties of one of the most standard Shanshu books, the precious copies of Jade Scrolls. This book describes the turmoil and all the gory details in the soul of the Duan Dadi, a deity of the Tanshan mountain. Neither I nor the prominent researcher of Shanshu genre, George Clark, or Professor Yu Zian, have found any information on some canonic version of this text. However, as of today, these scrolls were compiled based on a different text, the canon of 10 rulers. The genesis of the Jade Scrolls, its perception and its variations, as well as its structure and most popular images that we come across in various versions, as well as the creative literary tools and its ideology, are the subject of the second chapter. The third chapter analyzes the properties outlined in the Jade Scrolls from the point of view of other classical Shanshu books. Those are the Taishan book, the Wenchan book, and the Guan Yu canon. As a result of this analysis, we come up with the fourth definition, which is that Shanshu is the genre of prose in Chinese spiritual literature of a small or middle scale text. So any printing text can be covered by this umbrella term, Shanshu. Therefore, as a genre, this can be attributed only to a small number of texts by Chinese researchers and by the perceiving audience themselves. However, the influence of this genre is so immense on the aesthetic ideology of many generations, which has been noted by many scholars and researchers, compels us to think differently. What makes those texts so different? What allows us to outline those into a standalone genre? And our answer is that, first and foremost, we merge the contradictory syncretic components of folklore, beliefs and spirits. Second, the narrator is the deity itself. Third, such texts are sort of guidelines that compel for social and legal compliance. Fourth, the plot is underdeveloped. Usually it is structured on the basis of a framework concept, and versatile fragments and passages within the text are united by a single predominant motive. Fifth, the cluster structure allows to perceive the text as an integral whole in all its versatility. Sixth, the narration is that of a spiritual nature and promotes Confucianism values as well as Buddhism and Taoism is ousted to the margins. And lastly, point 7, the narration is structured according to some logic and the word images. So this means that Shanshu as a genre is somewhere in between a secular, spiritual and folklore Chinese literature. I should also mention that this genre is closely linked to the ritual tradition. Therefore, in my dissertation, elaborate commentaries are provided as to those rituals. The popularity of Shanshu is immense today. This genre penetrates the cinema and the internet. There are small-scale movies, there are apps for smartphones, for tablets. However, all this variety of genres of Shanshu forms is a task for future academic endeavors. Thank you for your attention. Thank you. Colleagues, guests, do we have any questions? Well, provided there are no questions, thank you so much. And now may I proceed to the reports. So the Supervision Expertise Center was submitted with 4 external reports from Tatyana Vinogradova, candidate of Historical Sciences, head of the Asian department in the library, Irina Zavedovskaya, assistant professor of the National University of Tsinghua, Taiwan. Anastasia Korobova, candidate of sciences, senior leading research fellow of the Chinese Culture Research Center under the Russian Academy of Sciences. Mr. Ulyanov, candidate of Historical Sciences, head of Chinese Philology Department of the Moscow State University, jointly with Madam Nikolskaya, docent, same department. Another report was provided by Igor Mayatsky, candidate of Philological Sciences, docent of the Arabic Philology Department of St. Petersburg State University. All the above-mentioned reports are positive, and their authors deem that Madam Kornilyeva's dissertation is in compliance with all the requirements. Every member of the dissertation board has submitted their reports, which is under the PhD awarding procedure, have been posted on the official St. Petersburg State University website. So may I proceed to the report?
Начну с своего собственного отзыва.
And may now give the floor to myself. The dissertation submitted by Tatyana Kornilyeva addresses Shanshu, a remarkable phenomenon in Chinese literature and culture. This term, though familiar in sinology, has been defined just as of lately. Kornilyeva is committed to partially expand the new knowledge and to provide a definition of Shanshu and a classification of this phenomena it brings together, as well as to investigate what makes it specific as a genre. This justifies the novelty of the dissertation. Notably, Shanshu is Chinese didactic literature that builds upon spiritual, moral, and secular wisdom and addresses all walks of readers corresponds to similar genres in other cultures. For example, let's take Russian Muslim population of the early 1990s. Their spiritual literature renders the fundamentals of Muslim ethics, rituals, the Quran and Sunnah episodes in simple words, including issues of personal hygiene. Such writings that are neither spiritual nor secular are somewhere in between and therefore have been considered as a travesty of literature or junk literature by many scholars. Nevertheless, its apparent popularity, which is especially immense in case of China, such texts satisfy the spiritual demands of the majority of population and therefore belong to national culture, the national mindset. Consequently, it should be studied, and Kornilyeva's dissertation therefore cannot be more relevant. This dissertation is a contribution in literary criticism on a global scale as well, as such texts are found with different cultures. As to the dissertation, I'd first and foremost highlight the impressive bibliography that includes sources and research papers in Chinese, 69, Japanese, 11 languages. Extensive Asian data strengthens the reliability of the research. The text of the dissertation refers to dozens of Chinese literary texts of various epochs and spiritual traditions. It exposes their ideological integrity. This speaks in favor of the defendant's profound knowledge. Chapter 1 considers all the dimensions of the term Shanshu. Each aspect is elaborately described. To me, most stunning was the data about the tables of merits and flaws that today have translated into software and applications for gadgets. This fact shows how national religious traditions adapt to new settings. Chapters 2 and 3 elaborately analyze Shanshu as a didactic genre by referring to 4 prominent texts. In Chapter 3, most impressive, to my mind, is the fact how Shanshu has emerged as a genre amid the competitive environment of Confucianism, Buddhism, Taoism. This progress instilled integrity between spiritual and circular dimensions to this end. Shanshu is clearly more of a circular genre that merges multiple ideology as different from Muslim and Christian religions. Undoubtedly, the findings on the meaning of the form Shanshu, as well as its relation as a genre with canonic spiritual text and its contribution to Chinese literature, are indeed valuable. However, I should mention a number of flaws. Firstly, the inefficient structure of the text, spelling and syntactic mistakes, misprints, as well as poor wording. This is what I want to start with. Generally, the content is what we would look first at. In this dissertation, the contents includes an introduction, 3 chapters, and a conclusion. For the reason unknown, neither of the 3 chapters has a title. Therefore, one is clueless as to how the paragraphs contained in these chapters are grouped and what's puzzling, titled. More so, paragraphs titled as the pathos of the text rendering and description of events, the images and heroes, artistic tools and devices appear in the second and third chapters. Without titles, it is impossible to understand in what way one chapter is different from the other. It is yet unclear why the script of the paragraph has titles in smaller size than the body. Another puzzle are titles of Chinese texts, the defendants referring to. At first, Russian translation texts are provided with Russian translation and transliteration of Chinese titles, apart from in hieroglyphs. Further down, in some instances, we see the Russian title or the translation or transliteration of the Chinese spelling. A case in point is the didactic text by spiritual leader Wen Chan. Capital and regular letters are also randomly used in the title. There is no uniformity, thus, of the title in some other cases, which is indeed inconvenient. Such hastily mixture of Chinese spelling, Russian translation and transliteration of titles is utmostly confusing for those who are not experts in Chinese philology. For example, the Jade Scrolls or Yui or the Canon of 10 Rules and Shivanzin, and awkwardly, two different titles are utilized in one sentence. A Taiwan researcher of the Jade Scrolls, Chen Jiaosan, also assumes that Yu Li belonged to the Jin dynasty. Some expressions leave readers clueless as what those could mean, especially when they refer to some Chinese concepts that are not explained in the body of the dissertation. Multiplication of virtues, or 5 or 7 word verse, retrocession times, lose the ritual with the wife's parents, Zuan. No one knows what that is. The introduction mentions 3 times Bao Zuan. However, the explanation as to what this means is nowhere to find. Notably, spelling mistakes and flaws are also there. Somewhere a preposition or a certain word misses or is in its improper place. There are some copy-pasted passages, and there are some grammatical and syntactic mistakes. There is no uniformity of personal names spelling, like on page 53, 54, page 59, page 84, page 85, page 7, page 85 again. And there is also an abundant use of colloquialisms, which is just inaccuracy. Well, just to save up time, I'm not going to refer to particular examples of such colloquialisms. As for the scholarly dimension, well, here I have few comments. In a paragraph on the origin of the Jade Scrolls that addresses religious, mythological and academic interpretations of the text's origin, the defendant should have clearly demarcated these interpretations. To the defendant, Illumination of the Jade Scrolls is one of the three elements in every edition of this book. Regrettably, the defendant does not share these illumination with the readers, in spite of their availability in the internet. Pages 11 and 113 include an identical passage. Some of Shanshu texts are revised by way of a special ritual for Luan and updated. Readers are curious to learn more about this fortune-telling exercise, as well as how these Shanshu texts are revised. No single word is mentioned, however. Despite this fact, all the above-mentioned remarks indeed scramble the overall impression, but the findings are indeed academic and can be integrated into university curriculum in Chinese studies, as well as in the theory of sinology and culture on the whole. The dissertation by Tatyana Kornilyeva under the title Shanshu genre in Chinese literature complies with key requirements stipulated in the decree 6821/1 as of September 1, 2016 on the PhD awarding procedures in Petersburg State University, and the defendant, Tatyana Kornilyeva, can be awarded the academic degree of Doctor of Philology, Candidate of Sciences in the subject 100103, Foreign Literature. Thank you so much. May I also read out the report of a member of the thesis panel, Mr. Alimov, who is not today here with us, and I hope I will not extend the time limit.
The work of Tatyana Kornilyeva is devoted to a special type of Chinese book collection, Shanshu, which is almost known for the Russian sinology. This is in particular draws our careful attention to this work, as in my view the present stage of sinology development has an important task to introduce for scientific use new sources and description of relatively unknown events. In this regard, the candidate's efforts are highly appreciated. The thesis comprises introduction, 3 chapters, conclusion, and the reference list. 185 items in Russian, Chinese, and European languages, as well as 11 internet sources. In the first chapter, the author analyzes Shanshu as a category of books and gives the history of this manuscript's research, examples of Chinese Shanshu classifications. She determines Shanshu religious identity and ways of distribution. Then she makes a proper conclusion that in the general sense, Shanshu is a special type of collection characterized by its main function, instructive, and ways of distribution near temples free of charge. Nevertheless, the accepted content of the term Shanshu is wider because this term involves any books distributed near temples, including religious vernacular books, special collections with its consistent pattern. Also, this term can be used for Baojuan. In the second chapter, Tatyana Igorevna sees into Shanshu on the particular example of Jade guidebooks. Its text structure, didactical component, imagery, and character system, figures of speech are carefully studied. The author states the moralizing narrative character, freedom of text diversification within one piece of work, frame text construction that we can provide with various text elements without any damage to the end result, as well as lack of aesthetic techniques and devices as a result of Shanshu utilitarian didacticism. In the third chapter, the author tests her previous observations on other Shanshu works and makes rather unexpected conclusion that similar formal and descriptive characteristics help Shanshu become an independent literary genre, as opposed to the class of the Shanshu books as a small or medium prosaic genre of literature positioned between the religious and secular literature, with a set of features listed in the previous subsection. Here we face the problem. I got confused at page 16, where the author states that these features are not enough to constitute a separate literary genre. In this sense, it would be more accurate to refer to the Shanshu as a category of books, or simply the Shanshu books. But the title of this thesis, as we remember, is Shanshu as a Chinese literary genre, whereas the presentation of the material clearly shows that Shanshu is a special type of a book collection, and in this sense dominates genres, allowing freedom in composing material inside the book according to the author's task. Obviously, the notion book category or book class is not a genre, which makes it difficult to contrast them, whereas the most part of the paper is devoted to this fact. Consequently, I have a question: why the title of the thesis bears the name as the genre of Chinese literature in particular? Why does this genre receives some characteristics at the end of the research paper, and what are these characteristics? Tatyana Igorevna introduces many of them, including both rather attractive ones and repetitive, as the plot is either poorly developed or cannot be found at all. The text is organized mainly by the frame of construction that allows to incorporate diverse elements of varying number and content. Cluster text structure implies greater freedom in adding or removing parts depending on recension, without any significant effect on the perception of the text as a whole. I can't see any distinction in this statement. All these characteristics more or less can be related to any not to only Chinese traditional works, which are not included by the author into Shanshu genre. The narration is characterized by a distinct moralizing tone, and the moral principles have an explicit social orientation clearly related to the Confucian ideas of an ideal society. Nevertheless, there is another important issue. It's better to determine specific formal and semantic attributes sufficient to ensure that these works constitute a separate genre of Chinese fiction, and Tatyana Igorevna did not manage to do it. Why does the author incorporate the notion genre into her work? It's not clear. Study it from formal and semantic angle. Investigate the topic of the text interaction between different texts, both in one story and whole collection, and between the collection. It can't be explained. Does it mean that the author is not able to understand the essence of the issue, or it is the result of inability to represent the research material in a literary and understandable way? What aspect is researcher in this thesis unfortunately gives a vague answer. If it is devoted to a genre, I don't understand whether it is in terms of European science or Chinese tradition. They have substantial differences, neglecting of which may lead to the wrong track. I would change the title to somewhat Shanshu as a Chinese literary collection, with further scientific use after studying a considerable number of such works. It would be better to pay more attention to the history of Shanshu formation process to better understand practical issues. It might have prevented Tatyana Igorevna from including into Shanshu Buddhist Shunsho of 4th and 5th centuries. It would be better to limit the research by the detailed study of one most popular Shanshu collection, which can be surely included into Shanshu by tradition. There are some other but less unsuccessful statements in this thesis. Shockingly, the author states that originally the word Shunsho was a title of one of the chapters of the dynastic history of the Shanshu that did not survive to our times. She refers to the book of Yermakov and his book, The World of Chinese Buddhism, in which late author did not write anything of this kind. Let's leave alone this term, dynastic, in relation to Han history. For me, it's not clear again where the author of the thesis got the information about one mysterious chapter from Hanshu, which did not survive. In fact, Hanshu chapters do exist according to bibliographical section. In fact, Hanshu chapters do exist according to bibliographical section. If the author is interested in the details, I recommend to read my book of 2014, Wonder Garden, The History of Chinese Fiction, Shunsho, the 1st to the 6th centuries. Less disappointing the drawbacks with the transcription and the order of the information in the thesis. Thus, there are sometimes no dates of the writers, scholars. The use of dash in some Chinese names in Russian is questionable sometimes. Hanshu, Zhenzun. New version of translation of some old terms is not necessary. Unprecise translation of some terms in the cause of misunderstanding the essence. Sometimes there are no bibliographic references. Prose titles are either in quotation marks or without them. The use of italic letters sometimes puzzles and makes the paper untidy. The reference list is far worse. This has become common in papers of young researchers. But that's all nothing if we consider all drawbacks mentioned above. To conclude, I regret to say that the research which could have become a breakthrough area of Shanshu study in Russia must be improved by the author. The author has collected a large amount of material, has gone deeply into the matter, but she did not manage to write logical, convincing text. At present, this research is underdone, contradictory, and it requires much deeper attitude to the issue. I suppose, after meeting everything I have mentioned, the paper will have the opportunity to qualify for the successful defense, and its author, Tatyana Igorevna Kornilyeva, will deserve the degree of Doctor of Philosophy, specialization 10103, foreign literature, literature of Middle and Far East. And now I would like to give the floor to Mikhail Igorovich Pelevin. Well, I could not throw away what I would like to shorten. Try to observe the time. Dear colleagues, the dissertation of Tatyana Igorevna, her task is to prove that Shanshu topic within the frame of the books aimed at mass reader receives the right to have a particular terminological meaning, therefore becoming a separate genre of folk literature, and Igor Alexandrovich is against of this fact, but the task of the thesis is write this, and the author of the dissertation had to consider this term Shanshu and highlight particular text types for works of Chinese didactical books, guidebooks, treatise of sympathetic response, Lord Superior Wenshan Tract on the Quiet Way, the Perfect Book of the Emperor's Guns and Title, leaving aside other works. These various hygiene reference books, medical reference books are not included into the research, and I think that this separation is quite proved, and nevertheless, such collections of works can be met in medieval Muslim, not only Muslim, but in whole medieval literature. For example, in Afghanian literature, they contain religious textbooks, the recipes of Quran, fortune telling, and so on. In the first chapter, Tatyana Igorevna analyzes 4 types of Shanshu texts which have something in common, and they represent the background for forming. These are short stories, poems and songs and spells. Analytical parts of the second and third chapters are devoted to the recognition and characteristics of various genre-forming qualities of Shanshu in such types of works as Jade guidebooks, referring to text structure, pictorial methods, set of characters, stylistics, ideology, literary and extra-literary functions. There are 2 semantic lines in the thesis which unites all the chapters and sub-chapters. Essentially, the key, this ideology or idea is that Shanshu didactic, which put together religious works, represent traditional social legal Chinese ideology attached to Confucian ideals of social structure. Tatyana Igorevna characterizes the content of this text on the whole as the description of underground red tape responsible for the sentence and execution of a punishment for moral offenses and wrongdoings, page 4950, in such a way behaves exactly opposite to underground red tape celestial chancellery described in one work, several dozens of departments. It is obvious straight descriptions of infernal and celestial chancellery should feed back historic culture specific concepts related to the structure and regulation of penal and bureaucratic Chinese organization. Afterlife judge and celestial lord images also reflect the conception of mundane administrative hierarchy. It is obvious that the hierarchical structure of the Shanshu text forms the syntactical and semantic aspect, aspects' point of view should be interpreted in the same way according to the author. Content analysis of the moral and ethic instructions in Shanshu text allowed the author to conclude that propagated codes of conduct repeats the Chinese traditional system of values based on Confucian principles, whereas an ideal personality in such pieces of work appears as an honest career civil servant, good, decent person complying with the language and spirit on Confucian commandments. Another core area of the thesis research involves syncretism of the ideology in Shanshu genre writings. Although this ideology gives the dominant position to the system of values with Confucian view of life and national identity apology, Shanshu texts, according to the author, contain intricately perplexed the statements of three Chinese doctrines. In fact, the thesis shows the way Shanshu works initially adapted religious, Buddhist and Taoist traditions to Confucian Chinese substance and afterwards being subject to moralizing tasks, which in their turn depended on Confucian ideology, suffered further changes and turned to what Kornilyeva called stylization, page 108. Although this stylization deals with formalities of Shanshu texts, still some of them have Buddhist Jade guidebooks or Taoist treatise on sympathetic response to the Supremes, spiritual slant in terms of the backgrounds of probable text sources. It's no coincidence that the author in the second chapter devoted to Jade guidebooks with a different level of detailed comments upon Buddhist elements, both large-scale, such as the Tale of Mulan, and trivial ones, for example, animal release, ritual, or demoniac images of hell attendants. The thesis also focuses on the history of Shanshu books, studying the role of Japanese scholars is highly appreciated. It is necessary to mention Kornilyeva's sensible view of the issue concerning the period when Shanshu was formed in genre of written literature. They show close genetic ties of Shanshu texts with previous Chinese traditions on the language level, taking into account a standard quotation transition into various phraseological units. And in order to dispute, I want to make several points. Although sinology has long used the term of the popular for special literary type to which the author attached Shanshu books, from outside this term seems too expressive and even partly ideology-driven. I believe it's appropriate if popular literature is by some features in contrast with folk literature, not to mention the fact that in the English version of the thesis, the author uses term popular. Then it's not a good idea to state that the text of Jade guidebooks appeals to the sense rather than to irrational apprehension. Although an artistic technique is this paper lacks variety, the images and names of the hell sections are figured. Let me to quote: the hell of being ground by a milestone, the hell where a god is pulled out, the hell of mountain with needs, the hell of being boiled in oil. They evidently appeal to the feelings and imagination rather than to common sense. Like this, a more gloomy Muslim hell intimidating wrongdoers, only with flame suffering, must cause unpredictable fear instead of adequate knowledge-based reaction. My main criticism is that the author avoids using titles of the parts, of the chapters. Some of them need further alteration. And I share the opinion about the language of the work. In some cases, it's better to correct the text itself. Besides, one more remark. Textual repetitions, contextual repetitions, for instance, the quotation. I have remembered it for the instantly. Whoever wants to become a celestial immortal appears 3 times in the text. These repetitions are out of place. Based on the authentic text on Chinese folk literature and combining the elements of literary and culturological analysis, the research work represented in this thesis is completely original and have scientific value. Moreover, it proves that Shanshu term may include the genre of special moral and didactic works, united by the form, content, and ideology. Thus, I think that the submitted work fulfills the requirements for the PhD, and I highly recommend Ms. Kornilyeva for the title of PhD as a degree in. Well, I'll give the floor to Igor Gerasimov.
Please observe the time limit. I indeed urge you. So may I read out my report? I'll try to make it quick in 10 minutes, and I will probably deviate from the text. The dissertation by Tatyana Kornilyeva, Shanshu genre in Chinese literature, looks at folk literature Shanshu that originated in China early 12th century and has survived so far. The bibliography informs that Shanshu has been overlooked in Russian scholarly tradition, which justifies the novelty of the dissertation. The dissertation includes an introduction, 3 chapters, a conclusion, an impressive bibliography, 185 positions in Chinese, Russian, Japanese, English, French languages. Notably, the focus on Chinese papers is the strongest. We find 65 papers out of the list that are the backbone of the practical aspect. There are also texts that the defendant acquired herself in China and which allowed the defendant to provide a solid escape of Shanshu in China and its perception. The first chapter analyzes Shanshu as an umbrella term for a variety of published items that are distributed in temples, folk religious or didactic literature, as well as Bao Zhuan, a specific text patterning strategy in folk literature. Here some information on the origin of such books is provided, which is presumably not enough for a diachronic study of Shanshu. The second chapter analyzes an individual and most popular example of Shanshu genre, the Jade Scrolls. Notably, Shanshu is defined as a type of books. This chapter analyzes the composition, the didactic aspect, as well as origin and perception of the text from the 18th century to the present day. The description of heroes is comprehensive and the narrative frame is exposed. Well, I even bought a book at the shop downstairs that is about these books, the ones that were recently described by the previous speaker, and those are indeed impressive and stunning, truly. Though at the beginning of this chapter, the defendant refers to several Chinese names of this text without Russian translation, but eventually she claims that the name Jade Scrolls or Yuli. Despite that, the title of the first paragraph contains a different name, Precious Copies of the Jade Scrolls. Regrettably, this seems to be a case of inconsistency. The third chapter is an attempt to apply the conclusions of the previous chapter to similar fiction. Conclusively, such items can be put together as a specific Chinese fiction genre of medium or small scale that is somewhere in between religious and secular literature. This genre may be arguably named as Shanshu genre in contrast to the type of Shanshu books. Thus, the final part of the dissertation is the one to refer the reader back to its title, Shanshu genre in Chinese literature. Add to that, we are clueless as to the definition of the genre or its specific properties, which actually compromises the dissertation as a scholarly research. Throughout the dissertation, it is still yet unclear what Shanshu means, whether it is a type or a category of books, or a literary genre. In case of the latter, its specific properties remain obscured. Because at the very beginning of the dissertation, it is said that Shanshu books are very sensitive to the challenges of time. So one can suppose that the focus has changed over time. Well, the objectives and goals of the dissertation include three positions: to identify specific variations of Shanshu as well as their individual properties. On page 11-12, nevertheless, the final provisions of the dissertation are included in the preliminary work on the dissertation. The objective and goals of the dissertation include three positions: to identify specific variations of Shanshu as well as their individual properties, to argue whether Shanshu is an independent genre in Chinese literature, and if so, then to identify key properties peculiar to this genre and to provide its definition. Having read the text of the dissertation, I personally feel that these objectives haven't been completely delivered on. What's astonishing is that the conclusion repeats the key statements that are subject to defense. The conclusion should also include answers to the objectives and goals. The dissertation lacks unity in terms of personal names. A French scholar is referred to by different names. On page 24, he is Vincent Goussard. Page 26-27, Vincent Goussard. Chinese names are spelled in a variety of ways as well, with a hyphen, or as one word, or as a set of words, pages 96, 91, 97. What's more, a literary research compels to incorporate either into the dissertation main body or as an appendix the translation of the analyzed texts or their fragments. What we see, in fact, in this research is translations of individual phrases that say nothing about Shanshu as a genre. I know that in St. Petersburg has many prolific scholars in China studies. The Internet, to say the least, came up with two books significant for this subject. Those are the book by Alimov and Kravtsova and a book by Mr. Alimov. a history of Chinese classical literature from early days to 13th century, poetry and prose, and the history of Chinese prose, the Gardens of Miracles, a brief overview of Chinese Shanshu fiction of the first to 6th century. These papers are regrettably overlooked in the dissertation, and so many others published in the last 6 years. To recap, may I reiterate that Tatyana Kornilyeva has put together some fascinating data on the perception of Shanshu collections, their contents and didactic aspects, exposing these illusions dominating in this text and maintained in Chinese literature. Such findings, however, are in tune with the sources, study or research on culture, not literary studies. Literary studies require better focus on genre properties, stylistics, artistic devices, authors' literary tools and methods. So in this respect, the dissertation submitted by the defendant requires further review. To my chagrin, I have to admit that the dissertation submitted by Madam Kornilyeva under the title Shanshu genre in Chinese literature does not fulfill with the requirements to the degree of Doctor of Philosophy, Candidate of Sciences in the indicated subject, and fails to comply with all the requirements under the decree. Thank you. May I lastly give the floor to Professor Fedotov. Please, the floor is yours.
Distinguished colleagues, well, I will shorten the content of my report.
The dissertation delivers on all the objectives presented in the text. Each chapter has a conclusion which makes it difficult to make it through the text and make the text too specific and very difficult to read, actually. It is well known that Shanshu books are highly important for Chinese culture. These books reflect folklore ideology. Over many years and centuries, the influence of these books was immense on the ideology in China. It was even more immense than that of Confucianism. The analysis of such books, as well as their perception in Russia and abroad, allows to identify the most key features of those. All this means that there is huge initiative behind this research endeavor. The objectives and the goals of the dissertation are indeed viable. Those are to analyze those books and to classify those and to consider the images in those books, as well as the structure of text and the literary world reflected in these books, as well as to describe the Shanshu as a genre and to identify its place in Chinese literature. Here, I should clarify that the latter depends on whether the defendant will be able to successfully prove the fact that Shanshu is a standalone genre. The list of sources is indeed impressive, which guarantees relevance of all the findings. Kornilyeva published her findings in 3 papers in the journals included in the Higher Attestation Commission list. Jointly with 2 other fellow scholars, she wrote a book on spirits and deities of Chinese hell. The first chapter considers such important issue as where does Shanshu belong among the entire scope of jhanas. Kornilyeva provides a massive analysis of its origin and its link to religious texts. In the end of the first chapter, the defendant concludes that Shanshu is a specific category of books that includes a variety of printed texts. The analysis of these books allowed the defendant to identify 4 meanings of the term Shanshu. The folklore character of Shanshu books covers a broad variety of topics, from religion to medicine. And let's not forget that these books are also didactic. The second chapter of the dissertation is the analysis of one of the most popular Shanshu books, the Jade Scrolls. The defendant, as tradition says it, highlights the link between these texts with the Tibet Book of the Dead. This book is a very complicated, a philosophically complicated text, and there is actually no accurate interpretation to it. I have worked on its translation for many years, and this was indeed a challenge. By drawing links and similarities between that text and the Jade Scrolls, we should refer to such book as the Georgi Dagini story, which is part of the folklore Buddhism. The second chapter meticulously analyzes the origin of the Jade Scrolls, their perception, translations, and the structure of this literary item. The findings prove that the approach is indeed accurate. The cluster structure of the text is noted, which adds to the flexibility of the narrative. The amount of incorporations within the plot may vary. Despite that, the authorship of the Jade Scrolls is ascribed to a deity, which automatically oozes out a man-made creation. The third chapter looks at other links between the Jade Scrolls and other books, such as the Taishan book, the narrative by Wen Chan, ruler, and the canon by ruler Guan. The logic of this comparison is indeed clear, because this is an attempt to compare the structure of the narrative, the description of events, the principles of the text patterning. All this allows us to identify Shanshu as a standalone genre. The conclusions provided in the end of the dissertation are indeed just. However, some of them need some minor editing. For example, on page 112, the defendant underscores that Shanshu is somewhere in between the secular, spiritual, and folklore Chinese literature. End of quote. And therefore, my question, isn't it possible for secular literature to emerge in the context of a secular literature or spiritual literature? What's even more strange is the absence of the names of chapter, but this has already been mentioned, so I'm not going to reiterate. All that does not spoil the overall positive impression of the research. May I specifically highlight the fact that the defendant is committed to promoting her endeavor. Overall, I should say that the dissertation submitted by Tatyana Kornilyeva under the title Shanshu genre in Chinese literature, submitted in compliance with the requirements for the degree of Doctor of Philosophy, candidate of Sciences in the subject Literature of Foreign Countries, Literature of Middle and Far East, complies the requirements stipulated under the decree as of September 1, 2016, on the PhD awarding procedure in St. Petersburg State University, whereas the defendant, Tatyana Kornilyeva, can be awarded the aspired degree of the Doctor of Philology, Candidate of Sciences, in the relevant subjects. Thank you for your attention. Now, Tatyana Igorevna, the floor is yours. You can reply to the commentaries in the reports. Your time limit is 15 minutes.
Distinguished colleagues, dear friends, I am very grateful to your support and for the critics. And unfortunately, I am pressed for time and I won't be able to answer all the questions and remarks. And let me stop on some of them. In his report, Igor Gerasimov states that the statements don't come in conformity with the requirements. Well, I want to explain that this document has a second part, criteria, and the third paragraph of clause 3.3 from 1996 about the science and state scientific and technical policy. There are general requirements for defended papers, and they deal with the quantity of publications, copyright, and no right to refer to their own previous research. These are the main requirements without which the thesis can't be accepted for the defense. Such aspects as the agreement or disagreement with the concept, with the whole concept, as for
and so on and so forth, indicated in those documents is not stipulated. So, consequently, as the expert claims, if my dissertation is not in compliance with the requirements as of the decree of September 1, 2016, there should be argumentation, detailed argumentation as to where it does not comply. Therefore, I believe that such a conclusion, such a statement is inaccurate. As for the testing phase, well, I have some data in my research on the one hand. On the other hand, it is not stipulated that such information should be included into the dissertation. Indeed, I performed with statements at a number of conferences, domestic ones and international conferences, Russia, China, in history in Kazan, the history on the Russian Far East literature. in a conference in 2016 and at a round table of the International Translation Forum. Moreover, the dissertation mentions the book that I wrote jointly with my colleague that reflects many conclusions of this dissertation. Those findings were presented at various international conferences, including the one in Crimea, the Beijing University, the Nantai University. The findings were discussed by prominent luminary experts from China, from Turkey, from Korea, and Japan. This book and my publications are broadly presented in international databases and collections. Therefore, I do not agree that there has not been any testing as to the findings of this dissertation. Actually, a public defense is an articulated validation of the conclusions, and none of the documents claims the opposite. Therefore, I claim that my text does not contradict all the requirements. Over the last time, none of the fundamental works on Chinese studies has mentioned these papers, nor the many-volume edition on the history of China under the academician Tikhinsky, printed in Moscow. Naturally, those books were not included into the bibliography. At the same time, I agree that further down the road, I promise I will include those in my research. And I'm actually grateful for this correction and for this reference. And I will refer to those books, among so many others, by Igor Alimov. As for the classical Shanshu, well, this identified the structure of the dissertation, which is focused on the historical and ethnographic aspect of those texts, as well as ritual practices. At the same time, I understand that Shanshu is highly close to folklore literature, and such shifts of focus is a standard. Such luminaries as Alexandrov, Veselovsky, Zelenin, all the way to the internationally prominent works by academician Alexeyev or his discipline, Professor Liftin. It is all there, indeed. Now, a couple of words on Shanshu as a genre. The properties of Shanshu as a genre were both supported by some scholars and undermined by the others, which actually means that I'm on the right way. And it is in a discussion, in a debate, that the truth will emerge. May I, however, provide a comment? When Mr. Alimov says that Shanshu is a separate collection of texts, he does not take into account the fact that those is not the same to a book. Shanshu is an umbrella word for any printed text, for references, instructions, guidelines, some images. Therefore, I cannot state for sure that Shanshu is a collection exactly. As for some formal definitions of specific classical Shanshu, including the Jade Scrolls, the logic here is absolutely different, as of mentioned above. It relies on the genre properties, the key genre markers. Those are first the contents, the topic and the problem, the structure of the narrative, the strategy of the narrative, the system of images and heroes. Third, authors' attitudes to what is imaged. Fourth, the conflicts and their development. Fifth, the pathos. Sixth, the literary devices, creative devices and tools, the stylistic tools. All those properties are no secret, and those are present in any standard textbooks on the theory of literature, for example, in those by Professor Ozerov. Those are not ideal, and they do not give one-size-fits-all solutions. But in works by Bakhtin, Mazhevsky, Zhermunsky, Vygotsky, Veselovsky argued on finer points of genre within the universal theory of genre. However, this does not mean that we cannot debate on this issue, and they offered a once-and-for-all solution. Bakhtin, among others, asserted that no text is deprived of a genre. Therefore, the Chinese audience intuitively perceive this text as a standalone genre. Therefore, our task is to describe classical Shanshu with regard to this perception. Therefore, what I suggest, may I reiterate, is that the first focus is on the study of those texts and their perception. I hope that further discussion would be able to identify some flaws in that. Obviously, one may not apply all of the properties to Chinese works. Thus, a system of folklore beliefs, this is something which is not specific to the written tradition of China, and it's inapplicable to non-Chinese literature. As for the deity, this is a property of texts that are about narrow Confucianism tradition. This does not allow us to include Confucian's notes with disciples into the notion of Shanshu. And I indeed claim that in my classification. In other words, looking at the formal structure and the formal properties as well as the pathos of the texts analyzed, we may not come up with a folklore text, any folklore text. Quite the contrary, this is a very narrow type of text, which I label as Shanshu genre. I hope that during the debate and further on, I will find more and more advocates among my fellow colleagues. I absolutely accept all the commentaries on the mistakes, misprints. So I really take that this is my fault, and I promise to correct that. But I believe that these inaccuracies, these flaws, did not scramble the logics of the dissertation as well as its scientific, scholarly and academic validity. May I once again extend my gratitude to all the members of the dissertation panel and to all the members of the audience. Thank you very much. Madam Kornilyeva, now we can proceed to open discussion. We have 3 people on the list. I would like Mr. Mayatsky. Mr. Mayatsky, so you provided a written report. So the speaker isn't talking into the mic, the interpreter isn't working.
Distinguished colleagues, good afternoon. I would like to make some remarks after after some discussion. But first and foremost, I would like to say that Tatyana Igorevna prepared a rather original and precious research. The topic is rather complicated, and nobody has previously researched it in our country. And the fact that she studied Shanshu books and she sees them as a literary subject, and it's a very bold action, and this action will help very fruitful results and appeal to many researchers and make them think about various issues concerning these books. And according to the discussion, we see that, in fact, these issues are very complex, they are diverse, and for this reason the research of Tatyana Igorevna is of some value. The value of the thesis is connected with the fact that it is based on the complicated, on the material which is difficult to obtain. The author obtained the material during her travel to China, to Chinese temples, and now this material represents a very precious collection. Then this material was carefully studied, and of course the remarks are very valuable, because the same events in the popular literature are interpreted in different ways, and sometimes they puzzle even the experienced researchers. And Tatyana Igorevna had scrupulously and carefully researched these sources, and it's very it is of high value. And the main peculiarity of the research is that it is between several disciplines. Academicist Alexeyev said that the sinologist should be at the same time a historian, ethnologist, and so on. Nevertheless, the reason for this is the material the researchers have to deal with. Nevertheless, Tatyana Igorevna studied this material as a literary specialist. As for the genre, in fact, this problem is connected with various events in the Chinese literature. The matter is, in the Chinese literature has many events which involve this or that term, and we may offer 5 arguments to call them a genre, and 5 arguments not to consider it as a genre. For example, truancy drama. Dmitry Ivanovich, I'm sorry that we are pressed for time, and well, we have to give the floor to the academic supervisor. Well, I have said everything. Thank you very much to Tatyana Igorevna for the research. Thank you for your attention. Thank you. I give the floor to Elena Kolpachkova, the docent of the department.
In your report, you mentioned, as far as I have understood, I'm sorry, I'm not an expert, you mentioned some tables of virtues and flaws. So what do you mean by that? It's a tables. It's very difficult for me to visualize those. And may I also give the floor to Madam Mironova, Assistant Lecturer of Chinese Philology Department. Distinguished Tatyana, Madam Kornilyeva. Well, as far as I understood, Shanshu are texts written by so-called the majority, and therefore my question, how were those texts reviewed, upgraded, if the majority is the author, so to say? No one actually. So, thank you very much for the support. As for the questions, Elena asked about the tables. Well, indeed, this is an exciting aspect. But traditionally, as of the Ming dynasty in China, they wrote tables where virtues and mistakes, errors were indicated. This means that every person has such a table, such a list of virtues and a list of errors. And every day a person puts down what good deeds he or she did over this year and what bad deeds he did. And every month they kind of tallied a balance, they tallied the total. And this is how it works. And it is believed that the deity this is how a deity would calculate whether it is a virtuous or a vicious person, and where this person should be looking at, right? What should be the destiny for this person? Well, electronically it's very easy to make, because you download an app into your tablet or iPhone, and on you go. You've got this table, and you can put down virtues and errors. As for the second question, thank you so much. This refers to Michael Nikolaevich's question as well on how these texts were upgraded. I mean, texts that do not have any authorship. This is what refers to Fuluan. Well, I'm more into literature, but I wouldn't like to plunge into ethnography. Therefore, I did not include any illustrations from the Jade Scrolls, actually. Well, this means that Nifulan, those are the future forecasting. What this ritual implies is that you need 6 persons, you split them into groups, one of them for the earth, the other for water, and the other for sky. And one of them is a supportive, the other is the leader, an assistant and a leader. Well, the sky group accepts the spirit of some deity and starts to act on behalf of this deity. This is how I may put it. So they cannot speak, what they can do is write hieroglyphs on sand, or they just put sand on the table, or they put some sand in a box and write hieroglyphs there. And there is a very exciting tool which looks like a stick of peach or ivory wood, and with a ribbon, with a band between the two twists. So the rest decipher this hieroglyph. I mean, those who belong to the water and those who belong to the end of the earth, those who belong to the beginning of the water, they put this rendering on paper. And this is how we come up with poems created by deities. And this is how this all emerge. Or pamphlets. Those are not people who write those, but those are deities. So this is kind of a standardized way to be informed on the on divine providence. Thank you very much. May I now give the floor to the research supervisor, Professor Starozhuk. Please, the floor is yours for 3 minutes only.
Thank you very much. I would like once again to say thank you to my dear colleagues and everyone who has come to this event. And I want to express my hope that Tatyana Igorevna, as a creative person, very interested one in this subject, will continue to study the issues of folk traditional Chinese literature and everything that was said here as a scientific discussion will be implemented into new, better Tatyana Igorevna's work. And now I declare a 5-minute break. Colleagues and guests may go and get some fresh air. We are waiting everyone back in 5 minutes. Слушай, а где остальные отзывы? Нормально вообще? А? Ты тоже?
Федотов медленно говорит.
Привет, привет.
Рад видеть, хотя бы так.
Рад тебя видеть.
Взаимно. Всего самого доброго, еще спишемся.
Нет? Всем общим друзьям.
Обязательно, обязательно, Саша. Спасибо большое. И за участие спасибо.
Приезжай в Софию.
Постараюсь, стараюсь.
Да, я еще раз, так сказать, поясню ситуацию вот с голосованием. Значит, у нас...
For the situation with the voting, all the reports were submitted 2 weeks before. They were posted on the website, so everyone knows which reports are in favor, which are against, but only those present can vote. Therefore, we cannot vote for Igor Alexandrovich, but his report was read out by me. But well, we heard it, and therefore, well, we consider it. But he does not participate in the voting procedure. Therefore, we do not take into account this report. It has no credit. Once again, if the report was negative, the person may vote in favor, so no one knows. So we vote as we deem most appropriate. according to the results of the defense. And therefore, I believe that we will vote as it was previously, and I will declare the results. Colleagues, I'm the chairperson of the dissertation panel, but I'm not going to share or to force my opinion upon you. Well, how would I force? Well, I will force in favor.
Ну хорошо, если так, она да, она прям, к Игорю Вячеславовичу прям с этими, как юрист настоящий. Может, и... Ну да, согласен, да, хорошо. Не. Вы знаете, я скажу так, вот была бы тяжелая была бы ситуация, если бы...
Да, Александр, а вы за, мы обсуждаем?
Я вас слышу, конечно. Вы уже голосуете?
Ну вот пока мы предварительно голосуем до публичного голосования.
Я понимаю.
Что будет?
Я остаюсь при моем мнении, которое высказал.
За, да? Все.
Ну тогда все.
Просто когда я сейчас скажу, что если Игорь Вячеславович, так сказать, будет голосовать против, это получается 1 против 3, это нормальная ситуация. Вот если бы было 2 против 3, если бы Игорь Александрович был... Вот. Да. Да, я согласен. Игорь Александрович, абсолютно нормально, да. Да, абсолютно нормально. Да, без проблем вообще. Ну, конечно, да. Все нормально, да. Все нормально. Так я тогда позову их, пойду, наверное, что? Да, или можно их позвать, в принципе. Конечно. Он сам виноват, потому что там очень много вот этих вот всяких ляпов. Итак, я думаю, все вернулись, уважаемые коллеги и члены диссертационного.
If everyone is back now, distinguished colleagues, members of the dissertation board, to recap the defense procedure, I have to put to vote the issue whether to award the defendant with the expired academic degree. May I remind that the decision is not considered legitimate unless over a half of the members of the dissertation board, but no less than 3, have voted in favor. So, Mikhail Sergeyevich, do you consider that Madam Kornilyeva deserves the academic degree of candidate of philosophy? Yes, I do. In favor. Igor Vyacheslavovic, no. Against. Alexander? Yes, in favor. So do I. I do. In favor. So we have 3 votes in favor, 1 vote against. Therefore, the Defense Board can legitimately award Madam Kornilyeva with the aspired degree of the Doctor of Philosophy, Candidate of Sciences. And please, your statement. Madam Kornilyeva, I extend my gratitude to all the members of the Dissertation Board for their criticism, for comments. First and foremost, I extend my gratitude to my research supervisor for his constant assistance, support, and valuable advice. I also extend my gratitude to those who supported me, who were around me, and cheered me up during all these years. Thank you so much. Now I declare the session of the Dissertation Board adjourned. Thank you for your attention.